Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Hercule Poirot as he investigates a murder hidden behind faith, and a single button sewn into a Bible that should never have been there. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind that button will make you question everything you thought you knew about innocence, guilt, and divine justice. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second. Until the very end. Chapter 1. The button sewn into the bib-leaf carriage clock on the mantel had just struck 10. When the scream tore through the silence of the study, it was not the scream of a fainting woman or a frightened child. It was rough, guttural. A cry of disbelief fighting its way past the throat of someone who had just seen death. With eyes wide open, Lady Eugenia Hargrave, widow of the railway magnate and host of the weekend gathering at Brackenton House, stood frozen in the threshold. Her silk scarf fluttered loosely from one arm as if caught in an unseen wind, and her pale, powdered hands still clutched the brass doorknob. In the dim glow of the oil lamp, the room appeared shrouded in quiet madness, furniture slightly askew, a vase of lilies overturned on the Turkish rug, and on the writing desk, sprawled over an open family Bible, lay the crumpled body of the Reverend Alistair Forbes. It was not the blood that unnerved her, it was the stillness of it. The man had died without a struggle, eyes shut, mouth sealed as though in silent prayer. The only sign of violence came from the side of his head, where a deep indentation suggested a single, decisive blow. His spectacles, snapped at the bridge, hung from one ear like a forgotten ornament. The Bible, beneath his chest, bore the imprint of his final breath. But it was what Lady Eugenia noticed next that sent her staggering back. Something was sewn into the Bible's binding. Something small and black and absurdly ordinary, a single button, stitched into the leather cover with thick black thread, and beside it, almost comically out of place, a needle still threaded with the same twine. The guests had gathered within minutes. A chorus of whispers filled the main hall as a footman drew the heavy study doors shut behind the body. A doctor had been sent for, though it was clear no one expected miracles. In the drawing room, people stood in uncertain clusters, some cradling brandy glasses, others pretending to scrutinize oil portraits on the wall. The murder, yes. No one dared call it anything else, had settled over the house, let the fog outside its windows. There were 8 guests in total, each with their own reasons for attending Lady Eugenia's retreat. There was Theodore Glynn, a war-weary professor of anthropology who smoked Turkish cigarettes and avoided eye contact. Margot Delancey, a rising young actress with an uncanny gift for impression and mimicry. Captain Douglas Arkwright, retired but forever stiff-backed, with an impeccable mustache and haunted eyes. Miss Cecily Blythe, a distant cousin of Lady Eugenia's late husband, whose love of psalms was matched only by her dislike of idle gossip. Mr. Martin Vale, solicitor to the Hargrave estate, bookish, bald, and always scribbling. Eleanor Winslow, a children's book illustrator known for her sweet voice and sardonic wit. And lastly, Father Thomas Breen, visiting from Sussex, who bore a certain shadow of familiarity with the late Reverend. All were present when the scream was heard. All had, earlier that evening, sat down to a game of spoken truths, Lady Eugenia's favorite dinner party entertainment. Each person asked to confess something from their past. It had ended awkwardly when Reverend Forbes, with trembling hands, refused to play. He had instead excused himself, muttering something about the sacredness of silence, and retired early to the study. No one knew what he had found there, or what had found him. By the time Chief Inspector Aldous Pierce arrived from the local station house, the temperature had dropped and a light snow had begun to drift across the hedgerows. Pierce was a practical man, and his instincts pointed him toward the obvious, robbery gone wrong. or perhaps a long-held grudge between clergymen. But the scene offered no simple explanation. The safe was untouched, no valuables taken, no note, no weapon, only the button. And so it was that Lady Eugenia, amid her grief and agitation, placed a telegram into the hands of her housemaid, addressed to London, "Send for Monsieur Hercule Poirot. A man has been killed. A Bible sewn shut. There's a button. Nothing makes sense. Please come at once." 3 days later, the famed Belgian detective arrived at Brackenton House, snow still clinging to the heels of his patent leather shoes, his gray felt hat angled just so. He wore a pale green cravat and a dark overcoat lined with violet silk. His mustaches, as ever, were immaculate. "Ah," he said softly, stepping into the great hall. "There is murder in the house, and also secrets. Behind him, Hastings carried their bags and gave a sigh already heavy with foreboding. And somewhere, in the locked study still bearing the scent of lilies and blood, the Bible waited, silent, sewn shut, holding its single black button like a riddle whispered in prayer. Poirot tilted his head, as though already listening. Chapter 2. The first Hercule Poirot stood before the heavy oak doors of the study, arms folded neatly, his gloved fingertips resting just beneath his chin. The snow on the soles of his shoes had melted into tiny puddles that glistened on the floor, like discarded clues. Chief Inspector Pierce, a man with a sharp jaw and dull instincts, watched him with a mixture of professional impatience and curious awe. "The body has been removed, of course," Pierce said, motioning toward the door. "But we've preserved the scene otherwise. I assumed you'd prefer it untouched." "You assumed correctly, mon ami," Poirot murmured, his voice gentle but alert. "The smallest disarrangement a chair to straight, a book slightly askew it speaks, yes? But only if one listens." He entered the study as if stepping into a confession box. The air held a faint trace of wax polish, overlaid by something metallic, sterile. Poirot's eyes passed slowly over every detail, drinking them in without haste. A writing desk angled toward the fire, a silver pen holder, capped but lying at a slant, a shattered pair of spectacles carefully placed on a side table, not dropped. The rug, faded crimson and gold, bore a single heel mark pivoting awkwardly to the left, and the Bible it still sat on the desk, its pages slightly crinkled from the Reverend's final breath. A ribbon marker was caught between the Gospels of Luke and John. But Poirot's gaze did not linger there. Instead, he knelt beside the desk and studied the black button sewn into the leather cover no longer, stitched crudely, as Lady Eugenia had described, but now partially unthreaded. The loose strand of black twine curled upward, like the tongue of a serpent disturbed. Pierce cleared his throat. "Our coroner believes he was struck with a blunt object, most likely something heavy but smooth. No skull fracture, but sufficient to kill instantly. The room was locked from the inside, windows fastened. Key was in his pocket." Poirot raised a brow. "A locked room murder, then?" "Precisely," Pierce replied, as if proud of the complication. "And this button?" Poirot picked up the Bible delicately and examined the inside of the cover. "Sewn from within, not without. This was done with deliberate intention, not hastily." He turned to Pierce. "What about the button itself?" "Doesn't match the Reverend's clothing, nor anyone else's, as far as we can tell. No one has come forward claiming it." Poirot did not respond at once. His eyes remained fixed on the pages of the Bible. Slowly, he turned a few leaves, his brow furrowing slightly at a passage marked with graphite, not ink. He paused on a page from Exodus, where a faint underline trembled beneath the words, "Thou shalt not sew new cloth onto old garments." "Curious," Poirot muttered. "Spiritual irony, perhaps, or an accusation." Pierce made a note, but seemed unimpressed. "We've also discovered that Reverend Forbes received an anonymous letter 3 days before his death. Unfortunately, he burned it." The housemaid said she saw him do it. Became agitated afterward. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. What else was in this room? No fingerprints beyond his. No broken locks. The fire was burning low, almost out. The embers were swept to one side as if poked recently. Poirot stepped to the fireplace and knelt once more. With gloved fingers, he plucked something from between the bricks, a long black thread, identical to the one sewn into the Bible. He held it up to the light and frowned. This thread, he said softly, was not pulled in panic. It was placed here, on purpose. The door creaked behind them as Hastings stepped in, brushing snow from his coat. The guests have gathered in the morning room, Poirot. Lady Eugenia has asked that you join them when ready. Poirot stood, brushing dust from his knees. Tell Lady Eugenia that I will join her momentarily. But first, he glanced at Pierce. Has anyone examined the Reverend's effects? We've inventoried his luggage. Standard clerical robes, a small shaving kit, and a diary. Locked, no key found. Then we must find it, Poirot said quietly. Because I believe someone wished very much that we wouldn't. As the two men stepped out into the corridor, Poirot paused beneath the portrait of Lord Hargrave, whose stern eyes seemed to gaze down through centuries of secrets. Poirot adjusted his sleeve cuffs with the precision of a man preparing to play chess. Rather than solve a murder, Mon cher Hastings, he said softly, do you know what is most revealing in a room such as that? The Bible, Hastings guessed. Or the thread? No, said Poirot, smiling faintly. It is the silence. A man about to die often leaves behind a noise, a cry, a scuffle, a chair overturned. But here nothing, not even a prayer. They walked on in silence, while somewhere in the house, the button waited to be recognized. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects. The morning room was a sunlit chamber designed for cheerful chatter and light reading. But on this day, it bore the hush of a funeral chapel. The tall windows had been left ajar to air the room, and though the snow outside had ceased, a chill lingered like an accusation not yet spoken. The guests had assembled in a fragile circle, each perched at a different point around the room and willing to draw too near to one another, yet too polite to disperse entirely. Lady Eugenia stood nearest the hearth, her gloved hands gripping a porcelain teacup she had not touched. Her expression had hardened into something formal, almost regal, but Poirot noted the tremble at her lip when she thought no one was looking. Poirot entered without announcement, Hastings close behind. The detective's presence caused a ripple in the room, heads turning, bodies straightening, eyes either meeting his gaze or deliberately avoiding it. Mesdames, messieurs, Poirot began, bowing slightly. Forgive the intrusion. I ask only for a few minutes of your time and your patience as we begin to untangle a matter of great delicacy. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, reading posture and eye movement as another might read a headline. You have all been kind enough to remain here at the request of Lady Eugenia, he continued, and I thank you. A man is dead, not by misadventure, but let us be candid, by deliberate hand. It is a terrible thing to say, yes, but more terrible still would be to pretend otherwise. Lady Eugenia nodded with a stiff grace. You have my full cooperation, Monsieur Poirot. All of us do, of course, murmured Captain Arkwright, arms folded across his uniform jacket. None of us wanted this, wanted it. Margot Delancey laughed too loudly, too brightly. It's murder, not a stage direction, Captain. Poirot turned toward her, mildly amused. Mademoiselle Delancey, you are the actress, yes? You perform at the Old Pavilion Theatre? She gave a gracious smile, her lipstick still perfect. Indeed, just finished a run of Witch of the Crossroads. Sold out, actually, a woman used to illusion, Poirot said with a nod. And therefore, perhaps, very good at recognizing truth when it is out of place. Margot tilted her head. Or very good at disguising it. Across from her, Theodore Glynn exhaled smoke and muttered. The game of masks begins. Professor Glynn, Poirot turned smoothly. You served in Mesopotamia during the war, did you not? Dig sites and dogfights. I'm not sure which unearthed more skeletons. He stared out the window as he spoke. Avoiding all eyes, Poirot moved next to Miss Cecily Blythe, who sat stiffly with a hymn book open in her lap, her lips silently forming psalms. And you, Mademoiselle, are you a relative of the late Lord Hargrave? By marriage, she said primly, without looking up. I keep the house in order, and the souls of those who live in it. An admirable task, Poirot said softly, though souls, alas, are harder to dust than banisters. Mr. Martin Vale, the solicitor, cleared his throat. If you require a full list of guests and their arrival times, I've recorded them. I always do when staying at Brackenton House. You are thorough, Poirot noted, but the list of names is less useful than the list of silences. Tell me, did you know Reverend Forbes well? Well enough to know he'd grown. Unsettled of late, reclusive. I saw him praying in the orangery at midnight, more than once. Poirot arched a brow. And you thought it normal? I thought it none of my business. Poirot moved to the edge of the fireplace, where Eleanor Winslow sat cross-legged in an armchair, sketchpad balanced on her knee, her fingers ink-stained, paused above a half-finished drawing, a rough outline of a button sewn into leather. You see, with an artist's eye, mademoiselle, I draw what I notice, she said evenly. And I noticed the thread was too thick for a Bible. It was the kind I use for bookbinding, not sewing clothes. A precise observation, Poirot murmured. Only one guest remained unaddressed, Father Thomas Breen, who sat near the window with his hands folded and face unreadable. You knew the Reverend personally? Monsieur. The priest nodded slowly. We studied theology together at seminary. He was a good man, troubled at times, but devout, and yet someone murdered him, Poirot said gently. Perhaps someone who knew that devotion. Perhaps someone who feared what it concealed. There was a sharp intake of breath, quickly swallowed by the hush that returned to the room. Poirot allowed the silence to linger before continuing. You must forgive me. I ask difficult things, but I assure you, it is not cruelty, it is necessity. For I believe the person responsible for this terrible act is among us. Every head turned slightly. Some brows rose, some eyes narrowed. The weight of suspicion had begun its slow descent. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. I shall speak with each of you privately, and soon. Until then, I ask only this. Remember not only what you saw but what you felt. Truth often hides in reaction, not recollection. He turned to leave. Come, Hastings. The thread is pulling taut. As they stepped from the room, Poirot spoke low. They are like portraits half finished, mon ami. But already, the brush strokes tell me, someone has painted over guilt. Chapter 4. Poirot Rivesnow had begun to melt into the gravel as the afternoon waned, leaving the grounds of Brackenton House coated in a dull, wet sheen that seemed to soak into the very air. Poirot stood by the library window, gazing not at the gardens, but at the reflection in the glass. His own face stared back, composed, analytical, untouched by the storm of unease that brewed in the rooms behind him. It is always the quiet ones, he murmured. Hastings, seated with one leg crossed and an eyebrow arched, looked up from a note card upon which he had jotted down guest names. You've already made up your mind, then? Poirot turned from the window. No, my friend. I have only begun to listen. But you see, already there are contradictions in their accounts, in their silences. Lady Eugenia entered just then, composed and clad in a deep plum dress that spoke of old money and private grief. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice carefully measured. You've had a chance to speak to everyone now? Poirot inclined his head. Yes, madam, and I thank you for granting such access. She nodded with the regal bearing of a dowager queen. I want this solved. Alastair Forbes was a complicated man, but no one deserves to die like that. Poirot's eyes flicked to hers. You say complicated. Why? Lady Eugenia hesitated, then crossed to the drinks cabinet, poured herself a half-inch of sherry, and did not drink it. He had beliefs, strong ones, and habits that bordered on obsession. He carried that Bible with him like armor, spoke often of divine punishment, but he also knew things about this family, about many families, things that made people uneasy. Poirot tilted his head, and yet he remained welcome here. He had been my husband's friend since university. There are ties one does not break, Monsieur Poirot, no matter how taut they become. She left the room with the soft rustle of silk trailing behind her, and Poirot stood still for a long moment, eyes narrowed. Later that evening, Poirot requested a walk through the guest wing. He inspected each doorframe, peered at locks, knelt by rugs, noted scuff marks on floorboards that suggested a hurried footfall or a changed decision mid-step. The corridor told its own story, movement, hesitation, stealth. In Reverend Forbes's guest room, Poirot lingered the longest. The bed was neatly made, untouched from the night before. A cracked leather satchel sat in the corner. Inside, a folded set of vestments, a silver cross on a worn chain, and a small carved box. Poirot opened it and found something unexpected, a spool of the same thick black thread. Ah, he whispered, the plot tightens. Back in the study, Hastings joined him as he stood once again before the desk where the murder had occurred. Poirot leaned close to the Bible, examining the remains of the stitching, the frayed edge of the thread, the impression in the leather where the button had been pressed against it. You know, Hastings, he said softly, the placement of the button is theatrical. A signal, not a mistake. A message, you mean? Poirot smiled. Or a warning. The murderer wanted us to see it but not to understand it. Not yet. He moved next to the fire and stooped, retrieving from the ashtray a scorched corner of paper that had been missed in the initial search. Hastings leaned in. Part of the letter? Poirot studied the charred edge. The ink had blurred, but two words remained legible. Cannot forgive. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered. Forgiveness denied. A thread of vengeance, sewn into holy words. They returned to the morning room just before supper, where soft strains of a piano played by Cecily Blythe floated across the house. Poirot listened for a moment, then turned to Hastings. You see how they wear their roles, mon ami? The devout spinster, the aging actress, the soldier hiding guilt beneath posture. This is not merely a gathering, it is a cast. You think it's all a performance? Poirot's voice dropped. No, Hastings, I think the performance is over, and now, the masks are cracking. He stepped out, his shoes clicking lightly against the floorboards. Tomorrow, the interviews would begin. Tonight, he would let them drift through the evening rituals of grief and suspicion. He would let them believe they still held control, and in the quiet hours, while the house settled into unease, Hercule Poirot would arrange the clues in his mind as a conductor arranges notes, for he already sensed it. The crime was not merely of blood. It was a matter of memory, of guilt, and of something far more dangerous: deliberate silence. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin following morning dawn, pale and brittle, the sun making a brief, reluctant appearance before retreating behind a curtain of cold fog. Brackenton House remained quiet, as though every clock and breath had fallen into a hush to reverent for daylight. Poirot conducted his interviews in the blue sitting room, a space chosen for its intimacy and clarity. The wallpaper, patterned with modest fleur-de-lis, seemed to lean inward, listening. He had asked for only one chair to be placed across from his own, a narrow, high-back thing that offered little comfort and no temptation to sprawl. Captain Douglas Arkwright was the first to arrive. He saluted out of habit, not ceremony, and took his seat with a rigid spine and clasped hands. You were among the last to see Reverend Forbes before his death, Poirot began, examining a creased pocketbook in his lap. I believe so. We spoke briefly in the corridor outside the study, Arkwright replied. His voice clipped and smooth. He seemed distracted. Did he say anything unusual? He asked if I believed in redemption. Arkwright shifted. I told him I wasn't the man to ask. Soldiers don't speak of forgiveness. It's not our luxury. Poirot watched the man closely. And what of guilt, Captain? Do soldiers speak of that? Arkwright hesitated. In silence, perhaps. Poirot let the pause lengthen, then dismissed him with a polite nod. Merci, that will be all for now. Next came Margot Delancey. She entered as if taking a stage, her silk dressing gown wrapped around her like a second skin, and sat with a flutter of eyelashes. This whole thing is ghastly, she sighed. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that scream again. You were not the one who screamed. Poirot said, mildly. No, she admitted. But it lives in the walls now, doesn't it? Poirot steepled his fingers. Tell me, mademoiselle, why did Reverend Forbes leave your game so suddenly? Margot's smile faltered. I may have pressed too hard. He refused to answer a question about his past. I teased him just a little. What was the question? Margot bit her lip. Whether he had ever broken a vow. He didn't take it well. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And did he? I don't know. But his eyes, they looked as though someone had lit a match behind them. Merci, mademoiselle. Theodore Glynn came next, trailing cigarette smoke and disdain. He sank into the chair without waiting to be asked. I didn't kill the Reverend. If that's what you're after, he said. Not at all, Poirot replied. I only wish to understand what everyone knew of him. Glynn smirked. You mean what everyone pretended not to know? You imply a secret. I imply that clergymen with loud opinions and buried truths often end up unraveling themselves. You have a specific truth in mind, monsieur? I keep to archaeology, not gossip. He stubbed out his cigarette in a silver ashtray Poirot had not placed there. But I will say this, the man hated to be touched. He'd flinch if someone brushed his arm. Poirot raised a brow. And did someone touch him recently? I saw Lady Eugenia rest her hand on his shoulder before dinner. He looked, frozen. Hastings entered as Glynn exited, handing Poirot a folded note. From Lady Eugenia. She's requested her interview be held last. She's unwell. Poirot tucked the note away without reading it. Very well. Bring in Miss Blythe. Cecily Blythe sat like a sermon upright, composed, uncompromising. Her hands rested atop a small prayer book, thumb tucked neatly into a psalm. You found Reverend Forbes disagreeable, Poirot began gently. I found him evasive. He wore righteousness like a garment he'd outgrown. That is a sharp criticism, mademoiselle. I do not make it lightly. He once corrected my interpretation of a verse in front of others needlessly cruel. He was fond of embarrassment. And yet you were in the drawing room when the scream was heard? She nodded. With the others. I had no reason to be near the study, none at all. Her gaze did not waver. I am not a liar, Monsieur Poirot. No, he said softly. But neither are you one to confess freely. She rose before being dismissed. Martin Vale followed, already anxious. His notebook was clutched to his chest as if it were armor. Mr. Vale, Poirot said, you strike me as a man who notices everything, and yet you say nothing. Vale blinked. I'm the family's solicitor, not an interrogator. But sometimes, monsieur, silence is a kind of answer. Vale hesitated. I noticed that Forbes received a parcel the day before his death. Brown paper. He seemed surprised by it. What became of the parcel? He took it into the study. I never saw it again. Poirot nodded. Merci, Eleanor Winslow was next. Her eyes, red-rimmed, betrayed little else. She sat sideways in the chair, legs curled beneath her like a cat. You were drawing, Poirot said. During the gathering, Why, it calms me. Observing people gives me clarity. I feel things more when I draw them. And what did you feel when you looked at the Reverend? Eleanor paused. That he was afraid, not of someone in the room, but of something in himself. Poirot leaned forward. You drew the button. Why? Because I've seen one like it before. Where? In a book-binding kit. Years ago. It's not a clothing button. It's a closure fastener for rare volumes or hidden compartments. Poirot's eyes brightened. You are very observant, mademoiselle. The final guest was Father Breen. He arrived last. Unhurried and grave. You knew the Reverend well. We shared a difficult youth. He was too earnest for his own good. Earnest in what? In repentance. Alistair believed sins had to be unearthed to be absolved. He didn't believe in forgetting. Poirot studied the priest. And do you? Breen did not answer. When the interviews concluded, Poirot and Hastings returned to the library. Poirot began arranging scraps of paper on the desk, names, contradictions, gestures. He was not building a case yet, only a rhythm. Hastings poured 2 cups of coffee. Well, learn anything useful. Poirot smiled faintly. They all lie, mon ami, but not about the same thing. And that is the music I hear already forming in my ears. Chapter 6. The first false lead wind outside had gathered force by mid-afternoon, dragging clouds low over Brackenton House like a gray shroud. Indoors, the mood was no less oppressive. Poirot sat before the fire in the library, fingertips pressed together, eyes half-lidded, his thoughts curling like the smoke from the logs. Across from him stood Chief Inspector Pierce, flushed from a renewed burst of confidence. He tapped a folded page against his palm with an air of quiet triumph. We've found it. Monsieur Poirot, he announced. A motive, and perhaps our culprit. Poirot opened his eyes but did not sit forward. Do go on, monsieur. Pierce laid the paper on the table. Reverend Forbes's bank accounts. We obtained a copy of a transfer dated 2 weeks ago, £500, withdrawn in cash from his personal savings. It was delivered to none other than Martin Vale. Poirot raised an eyebrow. The solicitor? Precisely. No explanation given. No receipt filed. When we questioned Vale, he stumbled, said it was a personal matter. A loan, supposedly. But £500 from a clergyman to a solicitor with steady income? Strange. Poirot's fingers tapped his knee gently. And what reason would Monsieur Vale have to kill the Reverend over this? Pierce crossed his arms. Debt or blackmail. Perhaps the Reverend threatened to expose him. Vale panicked, acted rashly. Poirot frowned faintly. Rashness, monsieur, does not usually come sewn into Bibles. Pierce flushed, but continued. There's more. The housemaid claims she saw Vale exiting the study late the night before the body was discovered. She thought nothing of it, said he looked distracted. Perhaps he returned after the Reverend was already dead, or before. Poirot murmured. And this is enough, you believe, to conclude guilt. It's a strong case. Means, motive, opportunity. Poirot stood, brushed a speck from his cuff, and looked toward the door. Then we must speak with Monsieur Vale again. Gently. They found the solicitor in the conservatory, hunched beneath the hanging fronds of a dying fern. His fingers fidgeted with a fountain pen, twisting it until the cap snapped. When presented with the evidence, Vale turned a ghastly shade of white. Yes, he said, after a long pause. Yes, the Reverend gave me the money. It was not a loan. It was insurance. Poirot sat beside him. You feared something? Vale stared at the glass. He asked me to keep something safe, a packet. He said if anything happened to him, I was to destroy it. What was in the packet? I don't know. I didn't open it, but you still have it. Vale hesitated. No, I burned it. The moment I heard he was dead, I panicked. Why? Because it felt like a trap, he said in a hoarse whisper. He never told me why he was afraid, just that the packet contained something that would hurt people. He said, "There are things they won't forgive me for." "Not ever," Pierce scoffed. "You expect us to believe this?" But Poirot was watching Vale carefully. "You are a man of paper and law, monsieur. You do not strike me as one who kills with a fireplace poker and leaves a button behind." "As a calling card, I didn't touch him," Vale murmured. "I only touch what he left behind." Back in the library, Pierce paced like a man robbed of a certainty. "You're dismissing it too quickly." "He lied. He destroyed evidence. He had access." Poirot gestured to the papers arranged on the table. "Monsieur Vale is hiding something, yes, but it is not murder. His panic is real. He is a man caught between duty and fear, not violence. No. This clue, it is designed to mislead. The first false lead," Hastings said softly, "exactament." Poirot said, "The murderer has placed us in a well-decorated room and invited us to admire the wallpaper. But I am interested in the floorboards." He reached for a note card and began writing. "Black thread found in fireplace, deliberate. Button equals not clothing, but binding." Eleanor Winslow's theory. Forbes received a package sealed, brown paper. Anonymous letter burned. Vale burned something else possibly connected. Emphasis on guilt and memory. Quote fragment. "Cannot forgive." Poirot tapped his pen against his lip. "The button is not random. It is a cipher. A closure, yes, but also a symbol. Someone wanted to bind something. Not conceal it, bind it." Pierce sighed. "So we're no closer." "Oh, but we are," Poirot replied, rising. "We are close enough now for the murderer to begin feeling unsafe." He stepped toward the window, staring into the fog. When the wrong suspect is accused, the right one begins to stir. That, mon ami, is when the real game begins. Chapter 7. The psychological gammoth fog had thickened by evening, blanketing Brackenton House in a kind of temporal suspension. Time seemed not to pass so much as pool, quietly, in corners and corridors. Poirot used the silence like an artist uses negative space. He moved less, spoke softer, made himself seem incidental until he wasn't. By now, the guests had grown unsettled. Poirot did not summon them. He simply drifted into their presence, overhearing, interrupting politely, asking questions so subtle they barely registered as inquiries. It was no longer an investigation. It was performance, and he was directing every glance and pause. At supper, Poirot said nothing until dessert. The conversation had dragged through neutral territory, weather, war, and theater. When the plates were cleared and coffee brought, he set down his spoon and said, almost lightly, "Tell me, Madam Blythe, when did you first learn to sew?" The question struck the table like a dropped fork. Cecily looked up, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "Sewing," Poirot repeated. "Surely someone in this household is skilled enough to bind a button inside a book." Margot leaned forward, smiling thinly. "Isn't it rather sexist to assume it's the women who know needlework, Monsieur Poirot?" "I assume nothing," Poirot said, eyes flicking toward her, "only that it was done with precision. Someone practiced, someone who did not want to leave a trace. And you think Miss Blythe did it?" Eleanor Winslow asked quietly. "I think Miss Blythe dislikes spiritual hypocrisy," Poirot replied. "And I think she watches others as one might observe a stain in an otherwise clean room deliberately. And with moral purpose." Cecily's eyes narrowed. "And what purpose would I have in murdering a reverend?" Poirot's reply was soft, almost kind. "Purpose? None, but perhaps righteous judgment. Perhaps old wounds reopened." Lady Eugenia intervened then. "You've made your point, Monsieur Poirot. Please don't turn my dining room into a courtroom." He inclined his head. "Forgive me, madam, but the room had shifted." Glances darted like insects. Unfinished coffee grew cold. Later that night, Poirot returned to the study alone. He sat in the very chair where Reverend Forbes had once sat. opened the Bible to the point where the stitching had been forced apart, and looked beneath the leather lining with gloved hands. Nothing more had been hidden there, but the page the Reverend had died upon was no longer just symbolic. It had meaning. Luke 12:2. For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known. Poirot whispered the verse aloud, then closed the book and let the silence grow. The next morning, he invited Theodore Glynn for a walk in the conservatory. "Tell me," Poirot began, watching a droplet gather at the end of a leaf, "why do you disdain the Reverend so?" Glynn smirked. I just find that men who speak of absolutes often hide the most." "What did he hide?" Glynn hesitated. "I think he feared who he once was. I overheard him one night. He was muttering something in Latin, and he said a name. Not a biblical one. A child's name." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "A child." I couldn't make it out. "But he wept afterward. I've seen men weep over death. This was different." Poirot said nothing. He simply turned and guided Glynn back inside. One by one, he approached each guest again, but never with the same question twice. To Margot, he asked about mirrors. To Captain Arkwright, about night terrors. To Miss Blythe, about silence in churches. Each question seemed offhand until it was single quotes T. And when he reached Father Breen once more, he asked, "Tell me, Father, what does it mean when a man sews a button into the Word of God?" Breen didn't blink. "It means he believed he was sealing something shut. Perhaps something he feared would escape." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "A sin. A memory," Breen said. "Sin fades, but memory never does." That evening, Poirot brought Hastings to the study and closed the doors behind them. "They are cracking," Poirot said softly. "The lies are beginning to rub raw against the truth. It is a matter of psychology now. We are not chasing facts, we are pressing upon fears." "And what are you expecting?" Hastings asked. Poirot turned toward the fire. "A mistake," he said. "The kind that only comes when someone believes they are still in control." He touched the edge of the Bible once more. "The real clue, Hastings, is not what is sewn shut, but what was once open and sealed again." Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. Brackenhouse slept poorly that night. Poirot, however, did not sleep at all. He spent the dark hours walking the corridors with silent shoes, pausing before doorways, listening to the rhythm of the house as though it were a patient whose pulse he had learned to read. The wind had quieted outside, but within the walls, something had begun to stir. An unease no longer passive. At 4:30 in the morning, a knock came at Poirot's chamber door. It was Lady Eugenia. She wore a long velvet robe and clutched a small lamp, her expression unreadable. "Monsieur Poirot," she said without preamble, "I need you to come with me. Something is wrong." Poirot dressed swiftly and followed her down the corridor, Hastings joining them moments later in a wool dressing gown. They descended to the ground floor, where Lady Eugenia led them not to the study, but to a locked side room, a narrow, seldom used chamber that had once served as a private library. She produced a brass key from her robe. "This room has been locked since my husband died. No one enters it, not even the staff." She turned the key. The door creaked open slowly, releasing a breath of stale, undisturbed air. Inside, the room was dim and narrow, lined with tall bookshelves that nearly brushed the ceiling. Dust layered every surface. The hearth was cold. Nothing had been touched. Except one thing. On the writing desk beneath the window, a small wooden box lay open. Its lid had been pried back roughly. The brass clasp snapped. Inside, where once papers had been carefully stored, there was only a single folded scrap of parchment. Lady Eugenia gasped. "That was locked." Poirot stepped forward and examined the box. "Forced open, but not recently. No dust on the lid. Someone came in here within the last 2 hours." He picked up the parchment, unfolding it carefully. There was no writing on it, only a single item, a button black identical, sewn to the page with thread pulled tight through for careful piercings. Hastings stared. Another one? No, Poirot said softly. The same one, or so they wish us to believe. He turned to Lady Eugenia. What was kept here? Old family documents, letters, my husband's journals. Nothing of importance, I thought. Did Reverend Forbes ever request access? Never. I doubt he even knew the room still existed. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Then someone wants us to believe the button has moved, that it wanders. But this, he tapped the parchment, is theater. An echo of the original clue. A performance. He turned abruptly and walked out. Wake the staff. Lock the exterior doors. No one is to leave the house. 10 minutes later, the guests were assembled once more, rumpled. Half-dressed, anxious, Eleanor Winslow stood wrapped in a shawl, her sketchbook clutched against her chest. Captain Arkwright had buckled his belt tightly and kept glancing at the window. Margot Delancey smoked from a slender ivory holder with trembling fingers. Poirot addressed them calmly. There has been a second intrusion, a symbolic act, a button sewn into a page and left like a footprint in snow. It is not a crime of violence, but it is an act of desperation. Someone is trying to redirect the narrative, to say, look here, but I ask you now. He paused, scanning each face. Who here has something they thought was buried? Who here fears not the crime but the revelation of what came before it? No one spoke. Hastings whispered beside him, What do you think it means, Poirot? Poirot replied in a murmur, It means the murderer is not hiding. They are correcting. They are rewriting their mistake. That afternoon, Poirot requested access to the household staff records in the servant's ledger. One entry stood out, a single name, crossed out in red ink. Clara Oakes, dismissed. June 1922. He pointed to it. Find out why she was dismissed. Pierce raised a brow. You think this is connected? I think, Poirot said, eyes narrowing, that someone else once tried to speak the truth, and someone else buried it beneath layers of stitched silence. As the light dimmed and the snow returned in soft, drifting flakes, Poirot stared again at the button. Not a clue, no. Not really. A confession. But one that did not yet make sense. He turned to Hastings. We are not chasing a murderer alone, mon ami. We are chasing memory itself. And memory, when threatened, will lash out with anything sharp enough to sew the past shut again. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. Snow did not settle that morning. It drifted listlessly, melting the moment it touched stone, as though even nature recoiled from permanence. Inside Brackenton House, Poirot moved with silent intensity. He no longer needed to gather facts. He needed to see how they touched Dot after breakfast. Poirot made a simple request. Each guest was to bring him one object. From their room, something personal, meaningful, yet unspoken of. An odd request, but they obeyed. They always obeyed Poirot when he asked without explanation. One by one, the items arrived and were placed before him in the drawing room. From Captain Arkwright, a military ribbon, frayed at one edge. From Margot Delancey, a pressed flower seal between two scraps of stage script. From Cecily Blythe, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials J.H. From Theodore Glynn, a broken cufflink, the enamel cracked in half. From Eleanor Winslow, a faded photograph of two children, the corners torn. From Father Breen, a page from a hymnal, annotated heavily in red pencil. And from Martin Vale, nothing. Only a note. I have already burned what mattered. Poirot examined each item with reverence. He touched nothing. He only looked. Then he sat very still, eyes closed. Hastings leaned in. You think the answer is in there? No, mon ami. But the pattern is. These are not just mementos. They are fragments of a history they all share but refuse to name. He lifted the handkerchief. J.H., he murmured. That is not Miss Blythe's monogram. That is his. Jonathan Hargrave. The late Lord Hargrave? Poirot nodded slowly. She kept it. Not out of affection but obligation. Or guilt. He turned to the photograph Eleanor Winslow had submitted. 2 children, one smiling, the other frowning. Both barefoot, one clutching a book. Poirot traced the child's face. This is not Eleanor. It is a memory she carries, and she keeps it hidden because it was taken here. At Brackenton, Hastings looked puzzled. So Eleanor knew the family before? She was brought here once as a child. Perhaps a guest. Perhaps something else. Poirot moved on to Glyn's cufflink. This bears the same crest as Lord Hargrave's university ring, he murmured. So what binds Professor Glyn to the Hargrave lineage? They pretend not to know each other well. But this was no chance gathering. He tapped the ribbon from Arkwright. And this, not just military memorabilia. It's from a burial service. Hastings, I want the guest logs from Brackenton House for 1919. Someone stayed here after the war who should not have. By midday, Pierce returned with the staff record concerning Clara Oakes, the dismissed maid. It says she was let go for inappropriate attachment to the child of a guest. He read aloud. Poirot looked up slowly. Whose child? Doesn't say, but it notes the incident took place in May of 1922, and that Reverend Forbes was visiting that week. Poirot rose. No wonder he came back. He wasn't just a guest of Lady Eugenia. He was circling the place where the secret began. Hastings blinked. You think this is about a child? I think it is about something buried and someone who tried to uncover it. Reverend Forbes was not killed for what he did, but for what he knew. Poirot moved swiftly through the house, stopping at the door of Father Breen. The priest answered without surprise. You've come for more than theology this time. I've come for truth, moaned Purr. Breen's shoulders sagged slightly. Alistair came to me years ago. He confessed something. Indirect, a burden he carried. I never knew its name. Only that it involved a child long ago, and that it was shared among several. Shared? Poirot echoed. Not fathered. Not by blood? No, but they all played a part. They let something happen, and then sealed it away. And now? Breen looked away. He wanted to speak, and someone couldn't allow that. Poirot nodded once and left. The corridor felt colder now. That evening, Poirot gathered the objects on the table once more. He added the button from the Bible, then the one from the parchment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a third one he had found beneath the floorboard of the study, wedged deep into a crack, buried with time and pressure. 3 buttons, 3 closures, 3 versions of the truth. Hastings stared. 3. Poirot whispered, No, Hastings. 1 truth. 3 warnings. He stood up slowly. We are no longer investigating a murder. We are excavating a silence. And before this is over, someone will try to bury it again with blood, if necessary. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. Snow had turned to sleet by morning, streaking the windows of Brackenton House with pale, soundless tears. The guests moved more cautiously now, conversations hushed, footsteps deliberate, eyes rarely meeting in the halls. They were no longer waiting for the killer to be revealed. They were waiting to be revealed as part of the story. Poirot had grown quieter, more inward. He spoke little during breakfast, only raising his head once when a silver teaspoon clinked too sharply against a teacup, startling Cecily Blythe so much that she dropped it entirely. No need for nerves. Mademoiselle, he said without looking at her. Unless your conscience has begun to itch. Cecily blinked, said nothing, and picked up the spoon. Hastings found Poirot in the study later that morning, staring at the family Bible again. You keep returning to that book, Hastings said softly. Is it the page? Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami. It is the binding. He opened the book to the inner spine, fingers delicate as ever, and exposed the leather lining beneath. Then, using a small silver blade borrowed from the letter opener set, he made a careful incision along a narrow seam where the leather met the board. Hastings stiffened. "You're cutting it?" Poirot did not answer. From the narrow slit emerged a small, flattened envelope so thin it might have been mistaken for part of the cover itself. Poirot withdrew it carefully. On the outside, in slanted handwriting, was a single word. Remember, inside, a newspaper clipping. Dated 19 to It was brief. Just a column buried at the edge of a local paper. Small fire reported at Brackenton House, no injuries. One child briefly unaccounted for, later found unharmed in the West Wing. There was no name. No details. Just the haunting phrase, later found unharmed. Poirot folded it back and slipped it into his breast pocket. "That," he said softly, "was the thread I felt but could not name." Hastings blinked. "You think the Reverend put it there himself?" Poirot nodded. He knew, but he was afraid to speak it aloud. So he bound it with the word of God, literally trusting that if he died, someone might find it and see what? That what was hidden was not merely a child but a betrayal. A silence agreed upon. Poirot left the study and walked slowly to the West Wing, where the older rooms stood mostly unused. Lady Eugenia passed him in the corridor and paused. "You've found something," she said quietly. Poirot stopped. "May I ask, madam, who was present at Brackenton during the summer of 1922? She stiffened. "My husband, a few family friends, some staff." "Why?" "Because someone lit a fire that year, and a child went missing for a time." Her lips went pale. "I remember no such thing." Poirot looked at her carefully. "Then you remember selectively, madam." She turned and walked away. In the West Wing, Poirot found what he had been seeking, not evidence, but architecture. Behind a faded tapestry was a thin service door, once used by staff, leading to a narrow flight of steps. The steps opened onto a cold, windowless room. Storage, perhaps, or a place to hide something, or someone. He studied the floorboards. They were uneven. One had a new nail, shiny, unweathered. Poirot knelt and pressed on it. It shifted slightly, but he did not pry it open, not yet. Instead, he stood in the center of the room and whispered aloud. "So this is where it began." As he exited the wing, he passed Eleanor Winslow in the corridor. She froze when she saw him. Poirot gave a slight bow. "You remember this wing, mademoiselle?" Eleanor said nothing, but her breath caught faintly in her throat. "That is enough," Poirot said gently. That evening, in his chambers, Poirot opened a clean page in his notebook and wrote, "The child was not lost. The child was left, and someone tried to make sure she forgot." He closed the book softly. "The crime," he whispered, "is not the murder of a man." His eyes narrowed. "It is the theft of a memory." Chapter 11. Tensions riseth. Next morning broke clear, and brittle sunlight touched the snow outside. But no one in Brackenton House seemed to notice. The guests gathered in the breakfast room not out of hunger, but out of fear of being alone. The silence between them had hardened into something cold and edged. Poirot did not come down at once. He allowed the nerves to twist a little tighter, allowed glances to become stares and small gestures to grow suspicious. Margot Delancey sat perched at the table like a cat, alert, coiled. She watched Captain Arkwright butter toast he did not eat. Cecily Blythe's hands trembled faintly as she passed the sugar bowl. Eleanor Winslow remained at the window, sketching nothing, the pencil in her hand unmoving. It was Martin Vale who broke first. His voice, taut and suddenly loud, cut through the murmurs. "Enough of this charade. We're being watched, prodded. Poirot knows something, and he's letting us stew in it." Margot smirked. "Oh, darling, it's not Poirot who's making you sweat. Perhaps it's that insurance you burned?" Vale's jaw tensed. "And what about your question to the Reverend, HMM? About broken vows? You always play with knives, Margot. Perhaps this time you drew blood. Before she could reply, Arkwright spoke. "Stop it, all of you. We don't know what happened, and until we do, slinging accusations only helps the one who did it." Cecily sniffed. That would be rich. Coming from someone who served in France and came back with more than medals. Arkwright shot her a look sharp enough to silence the entire room. It was at that moment Poirot entered. "Ah," he said mildly. "The tension. It reveals more than hours of questioning, does it not?" He moved to the head of the table, untouched by the atmosphere he had carefully curated. Hastings followed close behind, carrying a slim envelope in one hand. "I have reviewed the guest logs from 1922, Poirot said softly, placing the envelope on the table. "And I have confirmed something that has long hovered at the edge of memory." He opened the envelope and removed a yellowed guest registry page. One name had been circled in red. Miss Clara Oakes, accompanied by Ward. Miss E.W. All eyes turned to Eleanor. Her face remained still. "Miss Winslow," Poirot said gently, "you were the child who went missing during the fire. It is you who was once locked in the West Wing room." Cecily gasped. "That's impossible," but Eleanor finally looked away from the window. "It's not," she said softly. "I didn't remember. Not for a long time. Just shadows. A smell of dust. The sound of someone crying in another room." Poirot stepped toward her, and then something returned. A memory, half-formed. "Reverend Forbes came to you privately. He wanted to know what you remembered." Eleanor nodded slowly. "He asked about a Bible, about a game I used to play. He said something terrible had happened, and that I was the only one left who hadn't lied about it." Her eyes flicked to Lady Eugenia, who stood frozen in the archway. "I thought he was wrong. I thought I had imagined it." Poirot's voice remained low, precise. "But he was not wrong. He had found the Bible where the memory had been hidden, bound shut, stitched with gilt, and he wanted to open it." Martin Vale stood abruptly. "This is madness. You're building castles on sand." "No, monsieur," Poirot said. "I am uncovering what has always been beneath our feet." He turned slowly to the others. "You were all here, or connected to those who were. In 1922, something happened in Brackenton House, a fire, a frightened child, and a decision to hide, to forget, to stitch shut what should have been spoken." Arkwright looked pale. "What are you saying? That one of us hurt a child?" "I am saying," Poirot said, "that one of you hurt all of you, and that Reverend Forbes, in seeking to expose it, became the final thread that needed to be cut." Silence fell, deeper and heavier than before. Poirot stepped back. "We are close now. So close, and the murderer knows it." He turned to Hastings. "Tonight," he said, "we gather them. All of them. For one final question. But first let them stew. Let them fear that the Bible will open again." And he added, more quietly, because it already has, Chapter 12. The confrontation afternoon passed slowly, weighted with suspicion and the muffled footfalls of guests, who now moved as though watched by ghosts. Brackenton House had become a pressure chamber. Every creaking board, every mislaid glove, every sideways glance carried consequence. Poirot remained in the drawing room, seated upright with hands folded neatly in his lap, as if conducting a vigil rather than an investigation. Hastings stood nearby, arms crossed, trying not to glance at the door too often. "They're cracking." "Old chap," Hastings said under his breath, "you've wound the tension tight." Poirot gave a small nod. "But not enough, mon ami, not yet. A confession drawn under pressure is rarely honest. We must strike at pride, not panic." At that moment, the door creaked open. Cecily Blythe stepped in. She clutched a folded piece of stationery to her chest, her eyes strangely glassy. "I found this, tucked behind a drawer in the writing desk. I thought you should have it." Poirot took the note with delicate fingers, unfolding it carefully. A single line. written in the same slanted hand as the envelope hidden in the Bible. If they won't speak, the house will. Poirot stared at the words. Merci, Mademoiselle Blythe. This may be the key we were waiting for. She hovered a moment longer. Monsieur Poirot, do you believe sins committed in silence still stain the soul? Poirot looked up at her gently, more deeply than those shouted in the street. She nodded once, turned, and left when the guests gathered again at 6:30. It was in the music room, a high-ceilinged, echoing space filled with dusty instruments and the distant, almost imperceptible scent of rosewood. Poirot had arranged chairs in a wide circle. No hierarchy, no safe corners. Lady Eugenia arrived last. Her dress was darker than usual. So was her gaze. I believe, Poirot began calmly, that we are now past the place for shadows. It is time to bring light. He held up the letter from the writing desk. This was not written to the living. It was written to the house. A plea, almost, from someone who believed Brackenton itself would refuse to remain silent. And so it has not. He turned, slowly, to Captain Arkwright. Tell me, monsieur, why did you come to Brackenton this week? You have no relation to the Hargrave family. Arkwright hesitated. I was invited by Lady Eugenia. I'd met her late husband years ago, during a fundraising event. We shared a connection. I had served with his brother, not in the war. Arkwright paused. No, after. Poirot tilted his head. And that brother, was he ever at Brackenton in 1922? Arkwright said nothing. It is not shameful to remember, Poirot said softly. Only to lie about what one remembers. Arkwright finally said, Yes, he was here. I was too. I was 16. Margot Delancey leaned forward. What happened that summer? Why is everyone talking around it? Poirot turned his gaze to her. Because, mademoiselle, what happened was not a single event. It was a pattern. A silence cultivated and curated. There was a child, a game, a room, a fire. Someone went too far. He moved to the piano, where he had placed a small parcel, wrapped in aged linen. Poirot unwrapped it to reveal a second Bible, this one charred, warped by smoke, its pages still fused near the back. I found this beneath the floorboards of the West Wing. It had been sealed in wax and hidden. A child's name is scrawled on the flyleaf. He opened the cover. Eleanor W. Eleanor sat motionless. Her hand reached for her sketchpad, but did not move. I believe the Reverend found this. Poirot said, or knew of it. He confronted someone, perhaps gently, perhaps not. But he became dangerous not because he threatened violence, but because he threatened to unseal the agreement. The agreement all of you made, spoken or not. Pierce interrupted then, frowning. But what agreement? Poirot met his gaze. To forget. He turned to Margot. Your parents were guests that summer. You told me once you learned mimicry from adults who didn't want you to ask questions. That was not a metaphor, was it? Margot looked down. No. Poirot walked slowly back to his chair. The murderer is not the most cruel among you, not the most secretive, but the most cornered. The one who believed, above all, that silence must be preserved. His voice dropped. And that someone made a mistake. A very small one. He withdrew a photograph from his pocket. The image from Eleanor's collection. 2 children. He handed it to Hastings, who flipped it over. Written faintly on the back, Brackenton, May 22. E.W. and T.G. Hastings stared. T.G. Theodore Glynn? Poirot nodded. And yet he claimed never to know her before this weekend. Why lie, if nothing happened? Glynn rose suddenly. I was a boy. I didn't do anything. No, Poirot said gently. But you saw. And you forgot, didn't you? Or told yourself it hadn't happened at all. Glynn sat slowly, trembling. Poirot straightened his cuffs. The true murderer, however, did not forget. They could not afford to. And when Reverend Forbes appeared with his Bible and his memories, they understood the threat. They sewed the button into the book as a warning to themselves to stay shut. But when he tried to speak again, Poirot's voice softened. They silenced him. Hastings leaned in. "You know who it is, don't you?" Poirot said nothing. Not yet. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape evening came with a strange quietness, as if Brackenton House itself held its breath. The gathering had dispersed, but its echo remained in the walls. No accusations had been named, no arrests made. Yet every guest now moved like a figure inside a painting they could no longer control. Poirot returned to his chamber, his face unreadable. He removed his coat slowly, folding it with care, then sat beside the fire and closed his eyes not to rest, but to listen. The creak of distant footsteps, a door closing, then another, a stifled gasp, and finally silence. It was Hastings who knocked first. "There's movement, Poirot," he said, just above a whisper. "Someone's trying to leave." The servant at the south corridor said the boot cupboard was opened. The outer cellar door's been unlatched. Poirot's eyes flicked open. "Then let us not delay." They moved quietly through the eastern hallway and down the servants' staircase. The lamps had been dimmed, and their steps were muffled by old carpet runners. At the far end of the cellar corridor, they found it, the door to the garden stairwell swinging slightly. Icy air drifting in, and footsteps in the snow, only one pair. Poirot held up a hand. He moved to the door and stepped outside. The sleet had softened the top layer of snow, but not enough to erase the trail. The prince led across the gravel path and toward the woods behind the estate. Narrow, hurried, leaning. They followed in silence, Poirot's breath steady, Hastings keeping a few steps behind. After several minutes, they reached the edge of the woods, where the trees formed dark spires in the moonlight, and there beneath a twisted elm stood Cecily Blythe. She did not run. She turned slowly, her expression that of someone who had wandered into a dream she could not wake from. Poirot approached with quiet steps. "No more secrets now, mademoiselle," he said softly. She swallowed. Her hands were empty. Her coat was buttoned all the way up, her shoes damp with snow. "I only needed air." "You were not heading for air," Poirot replied. "You were heading for time. Time to burn something, perhaps, or to hide it again." Cecily lowered her gaze. "You were not the one who killed Reverend Forbes," Poirot said gently, "but you helped hide what made him dangerous. You knew the child. You were there in 1922, and you've known, all these years, who lit the fire." Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. Poirot stepped closer. "He came to you recently, didn't he? Reverend Forbes." He asked if you remembered. She nodded, barely. "He wanted me to help him speak, but you were afraid." "I wasn't strong enough," she whispered. "I thought if he brought it to light, everything would fall apart, and I couldn't bear it. So you tried to make him stop. I asked him to delay, just until after the gathering. I didn't mean for him to die. I never." Poirot placed a hand on her arm. "No, you are not the murderer, but you know who is, don't you?" Cecily didn't move for a long moment. Then, in a voice just above breath, "Yes." Poirot turned to Hastings. "We bring her back." Carefully, they returned to the house in silence. Cecily walked as if through snow deeper than her boots, as if every step required remembering something she had tried for years to forget. In the library, Poirot gave her a blanket and a chair. "You must rest now, mademoiselle. The final moment is near." Cecily looked up. "Will you tell them the truth?" "I will show them," Poirot said, "and they will know it, even the one who tried hardest not to." He turned to the fireplace, where the 3 buttons lay, one from the Bible, one from the hidden note, and one from beneath the floorboards. Each a silence, each a choice. Outside, the sleet continued to fall, but inside, the silence had changed. It was no longer protection. It was waiting to end. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. Storm passed in the night. Dawn arrived pale and breathless, and Brackenton House emerged into the hush of early light like something waking from a long, uneasy dream. But inside, nothing had truly changed. The fire in the hearth still hissed. The rooms still held their secrets, and in the study, Poirot waited. He had slept only a few hours, long enough for the threads in his mind to settle, long enough for the final shape of the truth to reveal itself quietly, inevitably, like a figure stepping through fog. At exactly 8 o'clock, he summoned Hastings. "It is time," Poirot said softly. "There is one piece still unspoken, but it is no longer hidden." Hastings looked at him, sensing the change. "You're ready to name them?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, but not yet aloud. First, there's a matter of confession without confrontation." He held up a letter. It was written in a woman's hand, folded once, sealed with a cracked red wafer. "I found this tucked inside Lady Eugenia's book of Psalms," Poirot said. "She must have placed it there out of habit, some part of her knowing it did not belong." Hastings moved closer. The letter was addressed simply, "To Alistair, if I am not brave enough to speak aloud." Poirot opened it. "You know the truth. I will not deny it. I saw the smoke from the west wing and did nothing. I heard the child call out and I turned away. My husband told me it would ruin us, that to speak would shatter the family. So I held the silence like a sacred trust, but I never stopped hearing it. That sound, that tiny, broken sound. And when you returned last autumn, I knew you had found what we buried. I begged you not to come back this week. You did anyway. I'm sorry. Poirot let the page fall to his lap. Lady Eugenia." Hastings whispered. "She knew." Poirot's voice was calm. "She did not strike the blow, but she sealed the room. She turned the key. The silence did not begin with her, but she kept it whole." A knock came. It was Eleanor Winslow. Her face was pale but composed. "I remembered more," she said quietly. "After last night." Poirot gestured for her to sit. "It was a game," she said. "A dare, really. They put me in the West Wing room and told me to stay until the candle burned out. It was meant to frighten me. It did." She hesitated. "And then someone lit the fire. Not in that room, but close. A rug, I think. I saw the light flickering under the door. I screamed. I pounded." Poirot leaned forward. "Did you see who did it?" "No, but I heard a voice outside. A man's voice, trying to whisper me calm. He said, 'Be still. Don't speak.'" Her voice faltered. "I think it was Theodore." Poirot said nothing, but his eyes flicked down to his notes. Glynn had denied knowing Eleanor before this visit, but the photo had proven otherwise, and the cufflink, his only personal object, bore the Hargrave family crest. He had been there. That afternoon, Poirot walked to the study once more. He asked for privacy, save for one request, that Martin Vale join him for a short discussion. Vale arrived quietly, shoulders hunched. His eyes darted across the room as if expecting an ambush. Poirot gestured to the chair opposite. "You have done everything you could to avoid being part of this," Poirot said softly. "You burned what the Reverend gave you. You lied about the money, but you did not kill him." Vale looked at him sharply. "Then why am I here?" "Because I believe you know who did." There was a long silence. Then, with a sigh that seemed to scrape bone, Vale nodded. "It was Theodore," he said. "I saw him leave the study that night, just after midnight. His gloves were missing. His hands were shaking." "Did you confront him?" "No. God help me, I couldn't. I was afraid. He's clever, you know. Always was, but cold. Capable of detaching. And he despised Alistair. Always did. Thought he was sanctimonious." Poirot studied Vale. "And yet you said nothing. I thought maybe the Reverend had pushed too far. Stirred up something that needed to stay buried." Poirot stood slowly. "Thank you, monsieur. That was the last piece." He waited until Vale had left. Then, at last, Poirot placed the 3 buttons in a row atop the study desk, next to the photograph, the scorched Bible, and the hidden letter from Lady Eugenia. The picture was now complete. The silence had ended, and the truth, raw, imperfect, irreversible, was ready to be spoken. Tomorrow, he would call them all together, but tonight, he sat with the full weight of memory. And memory did not flinch. Chapter 15. The final gathering morning returned with a strange stillness. Brackenton House, that monument to propriety and legacy, stood subdued beneath a sheet of frost, its windows dimmed as though reluctant to watch what must now unfold. In the drawing room, the fire crackled weakly, and the grandfather clock ticked like a metronome, counting down not to an hour, but a reckoning. Poirot summoned them at 9 precisely. No one refused. They came as if drawn not by duty, but by inevitability, like actors returning to a stage they once abandoned mid-play. One by one, they took their seats. Lady Eugenia, Martin Vale, Margot Delancey, Cecily Blythe, Captain Arkwright, Theodore Glynn, Eleanor Winslow, and Father Breen. Their faces bore the hush of the confessional. Poirot stood before the hearth, his small frame composed, his eyes bright and terribly calm. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, we are here not to revisit the act of murder alone, but to unearth what made it possible. For this crime-set tragedy was not born last week, nor even last year. It began long ago, in the summer of 1922, here at Brackenton House. No one spoke. Only the fire answered. In soft sighs, a child was invited to play. A game, they called it. A cruel little ritual. They placed her in the West Wing room, locked it, left her with a single candle. Poirot's voice remained steady, but its force grew with every syllable, and while she was trapped inside, someone, still a child themselves, lit a fire nearby, perhaps to frighten, perhaps to prove a point. The fire was small, but real, and the panic was very real. He turned toward Eleanor, whose hands now gripped the arms of her chair. You were that child, mademoiselle. She nodded once, silent tears glinting in her lashes. Poirot turned to the others. Those who participated, some directly, some through silence, made a pact, not formal, not spoken, but no less binding, to forget, to bury. He crossed the floor to the table, where 3 items waited: the scorched Bible, the photograph of 2 children, and the letter from Lady Eugenia. This Bible was found beneath the floorboards, hidden since that summer. It belonged to Eleanor. A child's scrawl inside it marks her name. Someone tried to destroy it, but it survived. As memory often does, Poirot turned to Lady Eugenia. You did not light the fire, but you heard the cries, and you turned away. You sealed the story with silence. You taught the house to hush itself. Her face did not move, but a tear slid down one powdered cheek. Poirot continued, Reverend Forbes was here that summer, not as a perpetrator, but as a witness. A young theology student then, unsure of his place. But later, he became consumed by what he had seen. The injustice of it, the silence. He paced, slowly. He returned because he could not carry it any more. He came with his own coded gospel, a button sewn into a Bible, a note hidden in the spine. He believed anyone would finally speak. Poirot now turned to Theodore Glynn. But you, monsieur, could not allow that. Glynn shifted in his chair, but said nothing. You were the one who lit the fire. A stupid, childish prank, yes, but one you could not bear to admit. You build a life on certainty, on reason, on scholarship. To admit to cruelty, to recklessness, it would unravel you. And when Forbes threatened to name it, Poirot stepped closer. You confronted him. That night, you demanded he keep silent, but he refused. And so, in a moment you've told yourself was panic ever since, you struck him. The room fell utterly still. Poirot's voice dropped. You used the heavy bookend from the shelf. You cleaned it afterward. Poorly. The missing gloves, the altered fireplace embers. The second button placed in the library, it was all theater. But you left one mistake, monsieur. He produced the photograph. You denied knowing Eleanor Winslow, but your initials are on the back. You tried to bury your past, but you framed it. Glenn's mouth parted. His hands lay limp in his lap. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to stop him. Poirot gave a faint nod. And then you meant to erase him. Lady Eugenia closed her eyes. Martin Vale looked away. Cecily Blythe made the sign of the cross. Eleanor said nothing at all. Glenn finally spoke. Voice hoarse. What will you do with me? Poirot said. I will do nothing. But the law, monsieur. The law is no longer sleeping. It is listening again. He turned to Hastings, who stepped from the corner and quietly left to alert Chief Inspector Pierce. Poirot looked once more around the room. No house forgets, especially not one built on silence. But sometimes, Mzamas, the truth is not a storm that breaks the walls. He paused. It is a breath that opens every door. Chapter 16, The Revealth. Silence that followed Poirot's final pronouncement did not break it unraveled. Theodore Glynn remained seated, hands limp at his sides, as though some invisible weight had finally settled onto his shoulders after years of floating. Just above them, he did not speak, nor did he deny. And perhaps that was the truest confession of all. Chief Inspector Pierce arrived shortly after. Summoned by Hastings without fanfare, he entered the drawing room with a measured step, glanced once at Poirot, then turned to Glynn. We'll take your statement formally, sir, Pierce said. But I believe Monsieur Poirot has made the matter clear. Glynn nodded, not in defiance, not even in sorrow, but in a slow, resigned way, like a man nodding to a fact that had always been true, whether spoken or not. I won't fight it, he murmured. I suppose I've been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Lady Eugenia turned her head sharply toward him. You murdered a man in this house, and now you speak of waiting? Her voice, though steady, had lost its noble chill. Something raw had begun to surface beneath her polished poise. Glynn did not look at her. I was a child when I lit the fire. I was old enough to know better. But I didn't think none of us did. It was supposed to be a prank, a story for later. And then the screaming started. He glanced at Eleanor, who held his gaze with astonishing stillness. I didn't mean to trap her. I just wanted to scare her. And then when she went quiet, I thought. She was gone. I ran. And I told no one. And when Reverend Forbes returned, Poirot prompted gently. He remembered too much. Or maybe just enough. He wanted the truth out. But Glynn swallowed hard. I couldn't let it be spoken. I've spent my life studying what people bury. Civilizations, lies, beliefs. But I couldn't face my own. He looked down. So I confronted him. I pleaded. I warned. He refused. Said it was time. Said silence had a weight, and that it was crushing everyone involved. I panicked. I grabbed the bookend. I didn't think it would kill him, but it did, Poirot said quietly. And then you tried to bury him all over again, with misdirection, with symbols, with fear. Glynn nodded again. Pierce moved forward and placed a hand on his arm. Come along now, sir. Quietly. There was no struggle. The others watched as Glynn was led from the room, his footsteps oddly light, as though guilt itself had become a coat he no longer had to carry. When the door closed behind them, the room remained still. Poirot turned to face the remaining guests. It is over, he said softly. At least, the part that was shrouded. The grief remains, but it may now breathe. Lady Eugenia pressed her hand to her chest. Do you think the house will ever be the same again? No, Poirot said. And that is a good thing. Martin Vale let out a slow breath, as if exhaling years of fear. Eleanor Winslow rose from her chair without a word. She moved to the window and looked out over the lawn, where snow had begun to fall again, not in sleet, but in light, drifting flakes that did not sting. Poirot approached her quietly. "You remember more than you say," he said. "I remember enough," she replied. "And I think I'll remember differently now." He nodded. "That is all we can ask of memory, that it allows us to see with gentler eyes. Once the truth has been spoken." She looked at him then, and for the first time since his arrival, she smiled. It was faint, fragile, but real. In the drawing room, Margot Delancey broke the hush with an exhale. "Well," she said, "I suppose this weekend won't be forgotten." "No," said Cecily Blythe, folding her hands in her lap. "Nor should it be." Poirot turned to Hastings, who stood beside the fire. "Shall we, mon ami?" he asked. "Back to London?" Poirot smiled. Back to order. They gathered their things with quiet hands. There was no need for farewells. Brackenton House had spoken what it needed to say. Its silence, so carefully kept for decades, had been broken not with rage or thunder, but with the slow, deliberate unseeming of a truth that had waited too long. Outside, the sleet had stopped entirely. And from somewhere beneath the snow, memory began to thaw. Chapter 17, Outcome and Justice be Noon. The great halls of Brackenton House had quieted once more, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the oppressive, coiled hush of secrets unsaid, but the hollow stillness that follows the end of a storm. It was the sound of truth settling into old walls like dust disturbed, then resettled. The police had departed with Theodore Glynn in their charge. There had been no drama, no last-minute protest, only the gentle, rusted squeak of the estate's wrought iron gates opening to let justice and shame out. In the library, Poirot stood alone, his hands behind his back as he surveyed the room. The fire had burned low, and the air still carried a faint scent of old paper and forgotten wood polish. The desk where Reverend Forbes had met his end had been cleared, but its impression lingered in the room like the last notes of a symphony. Hastings entered quietly. "The staff are already cleaning. Lady Eugenia's ordered the study locked until further notice." Poirot nodded, still gazing at the hearth. "The instinct to seal rooms is a powerful one, mon ami. But as we've seen, sealing does not mean forgetting." He walked slowly to the Bible, still resting on the shelf, though the buttons had been removed and the false threads unraveled. It seemed heavier than ever, as though it carried not faith, but consequence. "And Glynn?" Hastings asked. "He confessed again on the drive," Poirot replied. "Pierce tells me he spoke of the fire more than the murder. It was not the killing that haunted him, it was what came before, the moment of cruelty. The boy he had been." Hastings shifted. "What do you think will happen to him?" "Justice, I hope," Poirot said, "but justice tempered with understanding. He was a coward, yes, but not a monster. A man who had buried a truth so deeply he could no longer see around it. And when truth finally rose, it terrified him." Hastings considered this, then nodded. Later that afternoon, Poirot and Hastings were invited to tea with Lady Eugenia, her request, this time. The dining room was quiet, the curtains half drawn, the tea service immaculate. "I wish to thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said without ceremony. "Even if what you unearthed has left scars I do not yet know how to dress." Poirot inclined his head. "The truth does not soothe immediately, madam, but it allows one to begin." She sipped her tea with trembling hands. "I have written a letter to Eleanor. I do not expect forgiveness, but I owe her recognition." Poirot nodded approvingly. "That, Lady Eugenia, may be more healing than apology." Eleanor herself had left Brackenton that morning. Poirot had seen her to the carriage, her sketch-pad tucked under one arm. She had said little, but before stepping in, she had looked at him and asked, "Do you think memory is a punishment, Monsieur Poirot?" "No," he had answered gently. "It is a mirror, and sometimes a window." She had smiled at that, faint but firm. Then she had driven away. Back in his room, Poirot packed methodically, each button, cuff, and folded shirt placed with precision. But his mind remained behind, back in the West Wing, in the echo of a child's silence, in the uneven floorboard that had held a charred Bible like a tomb holds a name. Just before leaving, he walked once more through the corridor outside the study. The light there was different now, not brighter but clearer. The house no longer groaned with withheld breath. Downstairs, the car was waiting. Poirot stepped into the cold, gloved hands clasped, shoes sharp against the gravel. Hastings followed, squinting into the thin sunlight. "London, then?" he asked. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, though I confess, Hastings, some part of me remains here." "In the case?" "No," Poirot said, watching the upper windows, in the quiet. That delicate moment when a lie begins to break. It is a terrible thing, but also exquisite. The car pulled away. Behind them, Brackenton House stood still, but its silence at last was honest. Chapter 18. The closing remark. Back in London, the fog was familiar, the city's own brand of veiled truth, thicker than Brackenton's but somehow less intimate. Poirot's flat on Whitehaven Mansions was exactly as he had left it, perfectly ordered, softly lit, and faintly fragrant with lavender polish. The ticking of the mantel clock offered a rhythm to soothe what the countryside could not. Hastings, ever loyal, sat across from Poirot with 2 steaming cups of tea between them. "Well," Hastings said, settling into the armchair, "that was one of the darker cases, wouldn't you say?" Poirot nodded, his fingers interlaced. "Darker, yes, not for the manner of death, mon ami, but for the weight of what preceded it. There was no villain in the traditional sense, only a man whose truth came too late." Hastings frowned. "I still don't know how you were so certain it was Glynn. I might have believed any of them. Even Vale, for a time." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but that is because you listened to words, Hastings." He tapped the side of his head. "Listen to what is not said." The Reverend Forbes wanted to be heard, but he knew his voice alone was not strong enough. So he laid out a riddle of signs, a button, a thread, a Bible, each symbolic, each quiet, but each placed deliberately. He reached for a small notebook on the table and opened it. "Consider Eleanor's memory, not precise, but persistent. The fire, the voice outside the door. She did not remember the face, but she remembered the fear. The phrase, 'be still, don't speak.' That is not the reassurance of a rescuer, it is the command of someone desperate to avoid discovery." Poirot flipped to a page with Glynn's name circled. Then there was Glynn's lie. He claimed not to know Eleanor, but the photograph proved otherwise. A man of such academic pride would never forget a name or a childhood connection, unless he had willed himself to. He closed the book. Glynn was not a murderer by nature, but he was an intellectual deeply bound to the control of narrative. The Reverend threatened that, and so, in a moment of panic, he struck. The rest was an attempt to bury the act beneath misdirection. He relied on our tendency to look for the violent motive, not the frightened one. Hastings shook his head slowly. "It's remarkable, Poirot, but tragic too. I don't suppose Brackenton will ever host another gathering." Poirot gave a slight shrug. "Perhaps it should not. Some houses must be left to rest, just as some truths must be spoken once and then allowed to lie in peace." He sipped his tea. "Yet I find, in this case, a certain grace." "Grace?" "Yes, Hastings. Eleanor Winslow walks away from that place with a memory returned, not wholly healed but reclaimed. And Lady Eugenia, though proud, has chosen to write what she could never say aloud. That is progress. And even Cecily Blythe, so fixed in her moral rigidity, now knows that silence is not always piety, it can be fear, and fear can become complicity." He set the teacup down and folded his hands in his lap. "We cannot always prevent evil, Hastings, but we can, in time, understand it. and an understanding choose differently. The fire crackled in the hearth, offering warmth that Brackenton never could. Poirot rose and moved to the window. Outside, the city thrummed softly, its secrets carried in footsteps, fog, and breath. But here, in this small room, all was still. All the great puzzles, mon ami, he said, are not about murder. They are about the human heart. He paused, his eyes reflecting the lamps beyond the glass, and the threads we pull or leave knotted. Hastings said nothing. Watching his friend with quiet respect, Poirot turned from the window and offered a final, wistful smile. Come, mon cher, there will be another case soon. There always is. But for tonight, let us honor the silence that tells the truth. And with that, Hercule Poirot tortily, enigmatic, ever elegant, sat once more in his chair. The weight of Brackenton's silence behind him, and the murmur of London waiting ahead,